The gesture of kindness that changed everything. Maria sat behind the counter of a small diner in the bustling heart of the city, her fingers nervously tapping against a worn menu pad. It was another grueling evening, and the familiar weight of exhaustion pressed down on her shoulders. She glanced at the clock above the kitchen door. 8:45 p.m., still hours before her shift would end. The diner was quiet, save for the hum of the neon sign outside and the occasional scrape of cutlery against plates. It was an odd lull in what was usually a chaotic rush of patrons. Maria sighed. A slow night meant fewer tips, and with her 6-year-old son Lucas battling a fever at home, every dollar mattered. The bell above the diner door jingled, breaking her train of thought. Maria looked up to see a man enter, a figure so out of place that even the air in the room seemed to shift. He was disheveled, his clothes torn and mismatched, and his face bore the weathered lines of hardship. His eyes darted around nervously as he took cautious steps toward a booth in the corner. The handful of customers froze, their conversations halting mid-sentence. Maria noticed the way their gazes lingered on the man, some with pity, others with disdain. A couple seated by the window whispered loudly enough for her to hear. "What's he doing here? Shouldn't he be outside?" Maria felt her stomach tighten. The man's hands trembled as he sat down, keeping his head bowed as though he wished to be invisible. His bare feet, coated in dirt, were tucked beneath the booth. Maria couldn't tear her eyes away from the scene. Her coworker, Nancy, sidled up beside her with a scoff. "Well, there goes our tips for the night. Can't believe they let people like him in here." Maria frowned but said nothing. She wasn't one to argue, especially not with Nancy, who always seemed to have something sharp to say. Still, the sight of the man tugged at something deep within her. A sense of familiarity, perhaps. She understood what it felt like to be invisible, to be dismissed as if you didn't matter. After a moment's hesitation, Maria grabbed her notepad and walked toward the man's table. The murmurs around the diner grew louder as she approached. Ignoring them, she stopped by the booth and offered her warmest smile. "Good evening," she said gently. "What can I get you?" The man glanced up, his eyes meeting hers for the briefest moment before looking away. His voice was barely audible when he spoke. "Just a glass of water, please." Maria's heart clenched. It wasn't the request itself, but the way he said it, with a mixture of shame and resignation, as though even asking for water was too much. She hesitated, her gaze flickering to the empty tables around her and the judgmental stares of her coworkers. Without thinking, she made a decision. "I'll be right back," she said, her tone soft but firm. Back at the counter, Nancy was watching her with raised eyebrows. "What are you doing, Maria? You're not actually going to serve him, are you?" Maria didn't answer. Instead, she filled a bowl with steaming soup, added a slice of bread, and plated a small piece of leftover pie. As she worked, she could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on her. She didn't care. For reasons she couldn't explain, it felt like the right thing to do. When she returned to the booth, she placed the food in front of the man. His hands froze in midair, and he stared at the plate, as though it were a mirage. "I didn't ask for this," he mumbled, his voice trembling. "I know," Maria replied, "but you look like you could use it." For a moment, the man said nothing. Then, with a shaky hand, he picked up the spoon and took a bite. His movements were slow, deliberate, as though he was savoring every morsel. Maria watched him quietly, her chest tightening with a mix of emotions she couldn't quite name. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "You have no idea what this means to me." Maria smiled, though her throat felt tight. "It's no trouble," she said. "Take your time." She returned to the counter, but her thoughts lingered on the man in the corner. She wondered about his story, how he had ended up here, what had led him to this moment. Her coworkers, meanwhile, were less charitable. "Great, now we're running a charity," Nancy muttered under her breath. The others chuckled in agreement. Maria ignored them. She knew they wouldn't understand. The man finished his meal, stood, and carefully placed the chair back in its place. He turned to Maria, his expression earnest. "I'll never forget this," he said. "Thank you." Before she could respond, he slipped out the door and disappeared into the night. Maria stood frozen, her mind racing. Something about the encounter felt significant, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. As the night wore on, she found herself replaying the moment over and over. She didn't know it yet, but this small act of kindness was about to set off a chain of events that would change her life forever. A ripple of change. The week after Maria's unexpected encounter with the homeless man passed in a blur of routine. The diner buzzed with its usual rhythm, customers trickling in and out, orders called to the kitchen, and the clinking of dishes filling the air. Yet for Maria, something had shifted. She couldn't stop thinking about the man she had helped. His worn face, his hesitant gratitude, and the weight in his voice replayed in her mind during every quiet moment. Her coworkers, however, hadn't let the incident slide. Nancy had taken to calling Maria Saint Maria with a mocking tone, and the others joined in with snide remarks about her charity work. Even the manager, Mr. Dunbar, had pulled her aside one afternoon. "This is a business, Maria, not a soup kitchen," he said, his lips pursed in disapproval. "If you want to help every stray that walks through that door, you'll be doing it on your own time." Maria nodded, biting her tongue. She knew better than to argue, but the comment stung. She wasn't trying to be a hero. She'd simply followed her heart. Yet, as the days went on, the man's words, "You have no idea what this means to me," stayed with her. They reminded her why she'd acted the way she did. One rainy evening, as Maria stood by the diner's large window wiping down tables, the bell above the door jingled again. Her heart skipped. For a fleeting moment, she thought it might be him. But when she looked up, it was just another customer, a middle-aged man in a suit who barely glanced in her direction as he took a seat near the counter. She sighed, disappointed in herself for even hoping. Yet the memory of that encounter lingered, and she found herself scanning the streets outside whenever she had a spare moment, half expecting to see his familiar silhouette. The following Wednesday, Maria's shift began like any other. The diner was moderately busy, with customers chatting over coffee and sandwiches. The radio played softly in the background, blending with the clatter of dishes. Maria was refilling a customer's coffee cup when the doorbell rang. This time, when she turned, her breath caught in her throat. It was him. The man looked different, cleaner, more put together. His hair was combed, and his clothes, though still modest, were clean and neat. Yet it was undeniably the same man. He hesitated in the doorway, his gaze searching the room until it landed on Maria. When their eyes met, he offered a small, shy smile. Maria set the coffee pot down and approached him. "Hi," she said warmly. "It's good to see you again." He nodded, his hands fidgeting nervously. I wasn't sure if I should come back," he admitted, "but I wanted to thank you. Properly." "There's no need," Maria said quickly, but the man shook his head. "Please," he insisted. "You don't know what that meal did for me. It wasn't just the food. It was the way you looked at me, like I was a person, not a problem." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "That night, I realized I couldn't keep living the way I was. I went to a shelter the next day. They helped me clean up, and I started doing odd jobs. Nothing fancy, but it's a start." Maria felt a lump form in her throat. She reached out and placed a hand on his arm. "I'm so glad to hear that," she said sincerely. "You've made incredible progress." The man smiled, his eyes glistening. "It's because of you," he said simply. Before Maria could respond, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small battered envelope. "I wanted to give you this," he said, holding it out to her. Maria hesitated, confused. "What is it?" "Just something important to me," he said. "I thought you should have it." Curious, Maria took the envelope and opened it. Inside was an old, faded photograph. It showed a young woman holding a baby, her face glowing with warmth and love. The edges of the photo were frayed, and it had clearly been handled many times. "That's my mother," the man said, his voice soft. "She passed away years ago. She used to say that kindness could change the world, even in small ways. When you helped me, it reminded me of her, of what she believed in." Maria stared at the photo, her chest tightening. She looked up at the man, searching for the right words, but all she could manage was a quiet, heartfelt, "Thank you." He nodded, his expression earnest. "No, thank you, for reminding me that there's still good in the world." They stood there for a moment, the din of the diner fading into the background. Finally, the man cleared his throat and stepped back. "I should go," he said, "but I'll be back. I want to repay you for what you've done." Maria opened her mouth to protest, but he was already heading for the door. She watched as he disappeared into the bustling street, the photograph still clutched in her hand. That night, Maria couldn't stop thinking about the man and his story. She sat at her small kitchen table after putting Lucas to bed, the photo lying in front of her. It was a simple image, but it carried so much weight, so much history. She thought about the man's mother and the lessons she had taught him. Kindness can change the world. Maria glanced at the stack of bills on the table beside her, a constant reminder of her own struggles. Her life wasn't easy, and there were days when she felt like she was barely holding it together. Yet, in the face of all that, she'd managed to make a difference in someone else's life. That thought gave her a sense of hope she hadn't felt in a long time. As she got ready for bed, she tucked the photograph into a small jewelry box on her nightstand, alongside her most cherished possessions. She didn't know why, but she had a feeling that this was only the beginning of the story. Something told her that her paths with the mysterious man were destined to cross again, and that when they did, her life would never be the same. A door to the past. 2 weeks had passed since Maria's second encounter with the man, and life at the diner had settled back into its usual rhythm, or so it seemed. For Maria, things were different. The photo he'd given her now lived in her jewelry box, a constant reminder of the quiet, profound connection they'd shared. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the man's story, something unspoken lingering beneath his words. On a chilly Friday evening, the diner was unusually crowded. A wave of customers kept Maria moving nonstop, her arms balancing trays of plates and drinks. She barely noticed the bell above the door ringing anymore. It had become background noise. But when she heard a commotion near the entrance, her ears perked up. Nancy was standing by the host's stand, her arms crossed and her face twisted in annoyance. "I told you before, we don't need people like you scaring off our customers." Maria looked up and saw him, the man from before, now standing awkwardly in the doorway, his hands clutching the small paper bag. His clothes were even tiddier this time, and his hair looked freshly trimmed. But his posture betrayed his unease, his shoulders hunched as though bracing for rejection. Before Nancy could escalate the situation, Maria stepped in. "It's fine, Nancy. I've got this," she said firmly, shooting her coworker a pointed look. Nancy huffed but moved away, muttering under her breath about soft-hearted fools. Maria ignored her and turned to the man, her expression softening. "Hi," she said, her voice warm. "It's good to see you again." He smiled nervously. "I hope I'm not bothering you. I needed to see you." Maria gestured for him to follow her to a quieter corner of the diner. Once they were seated, she leaned forward, her curiosity getting the better of her. "What's going on?" she asked. "Is everything okay?" The man hesitated, his hands fidgeting with the edge of the paper bag. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," he began slowly, "about how everyone deserves respect. You have no idea how much that stayed with me." Maria tilted her head, unsure where he was going with this. "I meant it," she said, "but you don't owe me anything." "That's where you're wrong," he said, his voice suddenly firm. He placed the paper bag on the table between them. "I've been trying to figure out how to repay you, and I think I've finally found a way." Maria blinked, taken aback. "You don't have to repay me." "Please," he interrupted, his tone almost pleading. Just let me explain. He opened the bag and pulled out a stack of old, yellowed documents. They looked official, with crisp black ink and intricate seals stamped in the corners. Maria's brow furrowed as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. "This," he said, pointing to the top document, "is the deed to a property. It belonged to my family. It's small, nothing fancy, but it's in my name." Maria's eyes widened. "What? Why are you showing me this?" "Because I want you to have it," he said simply. Maria stared at him, her mind reeling. "You can't be serious. I can't accept something like this." "You can," he insisted, "and you should. That day when you helped me, you didn't just give me food. You gave me hope. You reminded me of who I used to be, and who I could be again. This property, it's all I have left from my old life. But I don't need it anymore. You do." Maria shook her head, overwhelmed. "I don't even know your name," she said, her voice breaking. "Why would you do something like this for me?" The man hesitated, his expression shifting to one of deep vulnerability. "My name is Enrique," he said finally. "And the truth is, I see a lot of my mother in you." Maria's heart ached at the sincerity in his voice. "Your mother?" she asked softly. Enrique nodded, his gaze dropping to the table. "She was a waitress, too. She worked long hours to support me after my father left. She used to say that kindness was the only thing in the world that could never be taken away, no matter how little you had." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "I lost her when I was young, and somewhere along the way, I forgot everything she taught me. I made bad choices. I hurt people I cared about. And eventually, I lost everything. My business, my home, my family." Maria reached out and placed a hand over his. "I'm so sorry," she said gently. Enrique looked up at her, his eyes glistening. "You reminded me of her that day," he said. "The way you treated me, with dignity, without judgment. It was like hearing her voice again. And I realized I couldn't let her memory die. That's why I want you to have this property. It's my way of honoring her, and of thanking you." Maria felt tears welling in her eyes. She wanted to protest, to tell him that she couldn't possibly accept such a gift. But the earnestness in Enrique's expression stopped her. This wasn't just about her. It was about him finding a way to heal, to reclaim a piece of himself that he thought he'd lost. "I don't know what to say," she whispered finally. "Say you'll think about it," Enrique said with a small smile. "That's all I ask." Maria nodded, her mind racing. "I'll think about it." That night, after Lucas had fallen asleep, Maria sat at her kitchen table with the documents spread out before her. The idea of accepting such a gift felt impossible, overwhelming. Yet, as she traced her fingers over the faded ink and embossed seals, she couldn't help but feel a spark of something she hadn't felt in years: possibility. Her small apartment was a constant reminder of her struggles. The leaky faucet in the kitchen, the peeling wallpaper in the bedroom, the drafty windows that let in the cold, all symbols of a life lived in survival mode. But this property, it could be a fresh start, not just for her, but for Lucas. As she sat there, her thoughts swirling, Maria couldn't help but think of Enrique's mother, a woman she'd never met, but whose legacy had somehow found its way to her. Maria wondered what she would do in this situation. The answer, she realized, was simple. She would choose hope, the road to hope. The next morning, Maria sat at her kitchen table, staring at the stack of papers Enrique had given her. The sunlight streaming through the cracked window illuminated the worn edges of the documents, highlighting their age and significance. Her fingers hovered over the deed, her mind racing with 100 conflicting thoughts. Accepting such a gift felt monumental, too big, too sudden. But the thought of a better future for her son, Lucas, was enough to make her consider it. As if sensing her turmoil, Lucas shuffled into the kitchen, rubbing his sleepy eyes. "Mama, what's that?" he asked, pointing to the papers. Maria smiled and pulled him onto her lap. "Just something someone gave me," she said, brushing his messy hair back. She didn't want to explain too much yet, not until she'd made a decision. But Lucas, ever perceptive, tilted his head and asked, "Is it something good?" Maria hesitated, then nodded. "It might be, sweetheart. It just might be." Later that day, Maria's curiosity got the better of her. She decided to visit the property Enrique had mentioned. With the address written neatly on a piece of paper, she bundled Lucas in a warm jacket and set out. The journey took them to the outskirts of the city, far from the noisy streets and towering skyscrapers Maria was used to. The neighborhood was quiet and unassuming, with small houses lining the streets. When Maria finally arrived at the address, her breath caught in her throat. The property was a modest single-story house with a faded white exterior and a small front yard overgrown with weeds. It wasn't perfect by any means. The paint was peeling, and the windows looked like they hadn't been cleaned in years. But it had potential. It felt like a place where a family could grow, where Lucas could play without the constant noise of city traffic. Maria stood there for a long moment, taking it all in. Lucas tugged at her hand. "Is this our house, Mama?" he asked, his voice filled with wonder. Maria crouched down to his level, her hands on his small shoulders. "I don't know yet, Lucas," she said honestly. "But it could be." The next day, Maria met Enrique at the diner. He was waiting for her at a corner table, a nervous but hopeful expression on his face. As she approached, he stood and gestured for her to sit. "Did you see it?" he asked, his voice laced with anticipation. Maria nodded, clasping her hands on the table. "I did. It's beautiful. It needs some work, but I can see how much it means to you." Enrique smiled, relief washing over his features. "It's yours if you want it," he said. "I've already spoken to my lawyer. The paperwork is ready. You just need to sign." Maria hesitated, her heart pounding. "Enrique, I can't just take something like this. It's too much." "It's not too much," he said firmly. "You gave me something priceless, Maria. You gave me my dignity back. This is the least I can do." She bit her lip, her eyes darting to the papers he slid across the table. The decision weighed heavily on her, but as she thought about Lucas, about the life they could have in that little house, her resolve began to solidify. "Okay," she said finally, her voice steady. "I'll do it, but only if you promise me something." Enrique tilted his head. "Anything." "Promise me that you'll keep moving forward," Maria said, "that you'll keep fighting to rebuild your life." Enrique's eyes softened, and he nodded. "I promise." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Maria signed the necessary documents, making the house officially hers. With Enrique's help, she began the process of cleaning and repairing the property. Every free moment was spent scrubbing floors, painting walls, and fixing leaks. Enrique, true to his word, showed up every day with tools and supplies, determined to help. As they worked side by side, Maria learned more about his past. Enrique had once been a successful businessman, running a small but thriving construction company. But a series of bad investments and personal losses had sent his life spiraling out of control. He'd lost his home, his family, and eventually his will to fight, until Maria's simple act of kindness reignited something within him. "I used to think I was beyond saving," he admitted one afternoon as they painted the living room walls. "But you reminded me that there's always a way back, even from the darkest places." Maria paused, her paintbrush hovering midair. "You saved yourself, Enrique," she said softly. "I just gave you a little nudge." As the house transformed, so did Maria's outlook on life. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of hope, a belief that things could truly get better. She still worked long hours at the diner, but now she had something to look forward to when she came home. Lucas, too, was thriving. He loved exploring the new house, especially the small backyard where he'd already begun planning a garden. The diner staff, meanwhile, was abuzz with gossip about Maria's miraculous windfall. Nancy, predictably, was the most vocal. "I guess being nice pays off," she said one day, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Maria ignored her, focusing instead on her work. She didn't need their approval. She knew what she had done was right, and the life she was building with Lucas was proof of that. One evening, after a particularly long shift, Maria returned to the house to find Enrique waiting for her on the porch. He looked different, more confident, more grounded. In his hand was a small, wrapped package. "What's this?" Maria asked as she approached. "A housewarming gift," he said with a grin. "Open it." Maria peeled back the wrapping to reveal a framed photo. It was a black and white picture of a young woman holding a baby, the same photo Enrique had given her weeks ago. But this time, it was restored, cleaned, and carefully mounted in a beautiful frame. "I thought it belonged here," Enrique said. "Your kindness reminded me of her, and now this house is part of her legacy too." Maria's throat tightened, and she blinked back tears. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." "No," Enrique said, his voice steady. "Thank you. You didn't just change my life, Maria. You gave me a reason to believe in myself again." As they stood there, the sun dipping below the horizon, Maria felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The house wasn't just a new beginning for her and Lucas. It was a testament to the power of kindness, of human connection, and of the belief that even the smallest actions can spark the biggest changes. And this was only the beginning. The unseen connections. The days were growing longer, the sunlight stronger, and the air warmer as spring began to settle over the city. The house was slowly coming together, but Maria still couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. While the repairs and paint jobs were coming along nicely, the house didn't quite feel like home yet. It wasn't the structure or the decor, it was something deeper, a sense of belonging that was still out of reach. Maria spent her evenings after work tending to the small garden in the backyard, one of the few things she was genuinely excited about. She didn't have much gardening experience, but Lucas loved helping her dig holes and plant flowers, and for the first time in a long while, Maria allowed herself to dream. She dreamt of a life where she wasn't just surviving, but thriving, where Lucas could grow up in a safe, stable environment, where he wouldn't have to endure the struggles she had. But even as she worked tirelessly, there was still something gnawing at her. The kindness she'd shown Enrique had led to this new life, yet the path had left her wondering about the mysterious connection between them. Why had he been so insistent on helping her? What had he truly gained from their encounters? Enrique's transformation was remarkable, but Maria couldn't help feeling like there was more to the story. One afternoon, while Maria was walking back from the diner, her mind still occupied with thoughts of the house and her growing responsibilities, she spotted Enrique across the street. He was standing outside a small coffee shop, talking to a woman dressed in business attire. The woman was listening intently to him, nodding occasionally, and Maria couldn't help but notice the professional air about her. Enrique, who usually dressed casually when they met, was in a sharp suit, looking every bit the businessman he had once been. Curiosity bubbled within Maria as she crossed the street. She approached slowly, unsure of whether she was interrupting something important. As she got closer, Enrique turned, his eyes lighting up when he saw her. "Maria," he said warmly, excusing himself from the conversation with the woman. "This is a pleasant surprise." Maria smiled, but her mind was racing. "I didn't mean to interrupt," she said, her gaze shifting to the woman, who was now studying her with a kind but professional look. Enrique noticed her hesitance. "Oh no, don't worry. Maria, this is Sarah. She's been helping me with some of the business side of things. I mentioned to her about the house, and she's been offering advice on some of the legal stuff." He turned to Sarah. "Maria here is the one who helped me turn my life around. She's the reason I'm standing here today, looking at things in a whole new light." Sarah extended a hand, her smile genuine. "It's nice to finally meet you," she said. "Enrique has told me so much about you. You truly made a difference." Maria shook Sarah's hand, her mind still spinning. She had assumed Enrique's life had turned around thanks to his own hard work and the support of the shelter and job he had found. But now it seemed there was a whole other layer to his transformation, a layer that included people like Sarah, people who were helping him rebuild his business and his life. "I didn't realize you were involved in business again," Maria said, her curiosity piqued. Enrique's eyes twinkled, but there was a faint trace of sadness in his smile. "Yeah, well, I'm still finding my feet. After everything that happened, it's been tough to get back to where I was, but I'm making progress. With Sarah's help, we've been looking into ways to reopen the construction company. There's a lot of work to do, but I'm optimistic." Maria's heart swelled with pride for him. She hadn't fully understood the depth of Enrique's loss before. She had known about his struggles on the street, but hearing about his past business endeavors, the life he had once had, made her realize just how much he had to rebuild. "I didn't realize how much you had before all of this," Maria said quietly, her voice filled with awe. Enrique looked at her, his expression softening. "It's not about what I had. It's about what I almost lost. I almost lost myself, Maria. I almost lost the person I used to be. But you showed me that it's never too late to start again." Maria smiled, but there was something bittersweet about it. As much as she wanted to feel only joy for Enrique's recovery, there was a part of her that wondered what it would take for her own life to feel as whole as his seemed to be. She had always been the one helping others, but who was there for her? The next few weeks brought a series of small changes, both in the house and in Maria's life. She continued working at the diner, of course, but now she had more hope, more drive to make her family's new life a reality. Enrique's efforts to rebuild his business began to bear fruit, and while he still wasn't completely back on his feet, he seemed more at peace with himself. Maria saw it in his eyes, a quiet confidence, a belief that he could face whatever came next. Enrique continued to help her with the house, lending his knowledge about construction and providing advice on improvements she could make to increase its value. Slowly, the house was beginning to feel like more than just a project. It was becoming their shared dream. She had her doubts sometimes, especially when things didn't go as planned. But Enrique was always there to lend a hand and encourage her. One afternoon, as they worked on fixing the fence in the backyard, Maria paused and looked at Enrique. "Thank you," she said, her voice full of sincerity. "I know I've said it before, but you've done so much for me, more than I could ever repay." Enrique set down his hammer and wiped his brow. "You've already repaid me, Maria," he said, his voice steady. "You've given me a reason to keep going. You've helped me believe in people again." Maria smiled and glanced over at Lucas, who was playing in the dirt with a toy truck. "I'm just trying to do what's best for him," she said. "I want him to have a better life than I had." Enrique looked over at Lucas and nodded. "He's lucky to have you. And you're lucky to have him." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Maria thought about all that had led her to this moment, the chance meeting with Enrique, his silent but powerful impact on her life, and the way they had both found new hope in each other. She had come so far since that lonely evening when she first helped him in the diner, and now her life was beginning to take shape in ways she had never imagined. But even as she reveled in this new sense of possibility, she couldn't ignore the feeling that there was more ahead, something still unknown and waiting just beyond the horizon. And whatever that was, she knew she wasn't facing it alone. The turning point. The summer sun was setting, casting a golden hue over the newly transformed house. Maria stood by the window, watching as Lucas played outside with his friends, his laughter filling the air. There was a time when the sound of his voice in her small, cramped apartment had felt like a constant reminder of how little she had been able to give him. But now, standing in this house that was beginning to feel like home, Maria allowed herself to breathe a little easier. She had never imagined that a simple act of kindness could lead to this life, this possibility. It wasn't perfect. They still had a long way to go. There were bills to pay, repairs to finish, and the weight of her responsibilities as a single mother never fully left her. But there was something undeniably hopeful in the air now. Maria had a new sense of purpose, and her heart swelled with pride as she watched Lucas build his little kingdom in the backyard. But as much as she had changed, there was still one question that lingered in Maria's mind. Where did she fit into all of this? While she had worked hard to create a new beginning for her son, the pieces of her own life still felt like they were scattered, like a puzzle with pieces she wasn't sure how to place. She had always put others before herself. Lucas, the diner, Enrique. And though those things had filled her heart, Maria had forgotten to take care of the parts of herself that needed healing. Maria's days at the diner had become routine, almost mechanical. She had gained more confidence, but there were still whispers behind her back. Her kindness to Enrique hadn't been forgotten. While she could ignore the rude comments from Nancy and the others, the tension in the air had become palpable. She began questioning whether she was still part of their world, or if her kindness to a homeless man had pushed her into a different space altogether, one that didn't fit with her life in the diner. One particular evening, as Maria was serving a table of regulars, she overheard a conversation that would forever change the way she saw her place in the world. "I heard Maria got a house, you know," one of the customers, a well-dressed woman with a sharp laugh, said. "A handout from a rich guy. I bet. Just goes to show. It doesn't matter how low you sink, someone will always throw you a bone." Maria froze in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. The words stung more than she expected. She had helped Enrique without asking for anything in return, but now it seemed as though her simple act of compassion was being twisted into something ugly. The whispers followed her, always just beneath the surface, and she was suddenly faced with a choice she hadn't anticipated. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She wasn't just a single mother scraping by. The kindness she'd extended to Enrique had set off a chain of events that had changed her life, but at the same time, it had caused people to see her differently. Was she still the same Maria? Was she still the woman who had worked tirelessly for everything she had, or had she become something else, a symbol of charity and pity, a person who was no longer part of the world she had known? That night, after closing the diner, Maria sat alone in her small kitchen. Lucas was asleep in the next room, his breathing soft and steady. The house was quiet, but Maria's mind was a storm of thoughts. She thought about the words of the woman at the diner, and the way people had looked at her in recent weeks. Had she done the right thing? Was she simply a charity case now, a victim of circumstance, or had her kindness truly made a difference in Enrique's life and in her own? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She stood quickly, her heart racing as she moved to answer it. When she opened the door, she found Enrique standing on the other side, looking more put together than ever. His eyes softened when he saw her. "Maria," he said quietly, his voice a little shaky. "Can we talk?" She stepped aside to let him in, her mind still reeling from the events of the evening. Enrique entered the living room, his gaze immediately drawn to the half-finished bookshelf in the corner. "I've been meaning to finish this," he said, his tone light, but there was an unspoken weight in his words. Maria sat down, gesturing for him to take a seat. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice laced with uncertainty. Enrique hesitated before he spoke again. "I've been thinking a lot about everything. The house, what you did for me, and what I've been trying to do with my life." He paused, his eyes meeting hers. "I wanted to tell you something I've been holding back." Maria leaned forward, her heart in her throat. She had no idea what to expect, but the gravity of his tone told her that this conversation was long overdue. Enrique took a deep breath, then said, "Maria, I've been working hard to rebuild my business, but I've realized something important. I can't do it alone. I need you, your strength, your insight, your heart. And I think, more than anything, we could help each other." Maria's mind was spinning, her thoughts fighting to catch up. "What do you mean?" she asked cautiously. "I know you've been struggling with this decision," Enrique said, his eyes never leaving hers. "The house, the changes, the way people look at you now. I know you're asking yourself if this is the life you want, if you're still the woman you used to be, or if you've become something else entirely. But I see you, Maria. I see who you are, and I know you have the power to do so much more than you think. Maria opened her mouth to protest, but Enrique held up a hand. I'm not asking you to change who you are. I'm asking you to stand beside me, as an equal, to help me build something from the ground up. We can take that property and turn it into something that means more than just a house. We can make it a place that matters, a place for people to rebuild their lives, just like we did. Maria felt her breath catch in her throat. She hadn't expected this, not in a million years. Enrique was offering her something more than just a place in his business. He was offering her a chance to be part of something bigger, a chance to make a real difference. I don't know if I'm ready for that, Maria said quietly, her voice uncertain. You don't have to be ready yet, Enrique said, his tone gentle but persistent. But I'm not going anywhere, Maria. I'm here for you, and I always will be. We've both come a long way, and I believe we can go even further together. That night, as Maria lay in bed, her thoughts raced. The house, the business, the new life she was building. All of it was still so new, so fragile. But Enrique's words echoed in her mind. We can do this together. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to truly consider what that might mean for her and for Lucas. The journey hadn't been easy, and there were still many obstacles ahead. But Maria now understood that it wasn't about doing everything on her own. Sometimes, the hardest part of healing was learning to accept help and to trust that you weren't alone. As the moonlight filtered through the window, Maria made a decision. She wasn't going to let fear or doubt control her future. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, she felt ready to walk it, side by side with Enrique, and with the hope that had always been waiting for her, just beyond the horizon. Maria stared at the ceiling of her bedroom, replaying Enrique's words in her mind. We can do this together. It was a tempting idea, a partnership, a shared vision for something bigger than either of them. But with temptation came fear. What if she failed? What if she wasn't strong enough to take on such a monumental task? The weight of her responsibilities as a mother and the scars of her struggles left her hesitant to take such a leap. But then she thought of Lucas, of the laughter that had filled the house earlier that evening. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about building a future, a life where she could show her son that challenges could be met and dreams could be realized. The next day, Maria met Enrique at the house. He had brought coffee and pastries, setting them on the small, wobbly table they had salvaged for the kitchen. The aroma of fresh coffee filled the air as they sat together, the sunlight streaming through the windows. You seemed unsure last night, Enrique said, breaking the silence. I don't want to pressure you, Maria, but I meant what I said. I believe in this. I believe in you. Maria wrapped her hands around her coffee mug, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. It's not that I don't want to, she said softly. It's just, I've spent so long trying to survive. I don't know if I know how to do anything else. Enrique leaned forward, his expression earnest. You've been doing more than surviving, Maria. You've been inspiring. Look at what you've done for Lucas, for this house, for me. You think that's just survival. That's strength. That's vision. Maria looked at him, her heart racing. Could she really be the person Enrique saw in her? The idea of stepping into something so unknown was daunting, but there was also a spark of excitement she couldn't ignore. What would this look like? She asked, her voice cautious but curious. If I said yes, what would we be doing? Enrique's face lit up, as though he had been waiting for her to ask. The house, he began. We start here. We turn it into something more. A community space, maybe. A place where people who've fallen on hard times can find help. A shelter, a resource hub, whatever we can dream up. You and I both know what it's like to feel lost. Let's give others a way to find their footing again. Maria's mind raced with possibilities. The house had already become a symbol of hope for her and Lucas. Could it be the same for others? "It sounds big," she said finally, "and expensive." Enrique nodded. "It will be. But I've started rebuilding my contacts. There are people willing to invest in something like this. And I've learned how to live with less. I'm ready to put everything I have into this. But I can't do it without you." Maria was silent for a long moment, staring down at her coffee. Finally, she looked up, her eyes meeting his. "Okay," she said, her voice steady. "Let's do it. But I have one condition." Enrique tilted his head. "What's that?" "This isn't just your project," Maria said. "If we're doing this, it has to be ours. Equal partners." Enrique's smile was wide and genuine. "I wouldn't want it any other way." The next few months were a whirlwind of activity. Maria and Enrique threw themselves into the project, their vision for the house evolving with each passing day. They decided to turn it into a community resource center, a place where people could find temporary shelter, meals, job training, and emotional support. Enrique tapped into his network, reconnecting with former colleagues and friends who were eager to help. Maria, meanwhile, reached out to local organizations and businesses, securing donations of supplies and furniture. The work was exhausting but exhilarating. Maria found herself learning new skills she never thought she'd need. Managing budgets, organizing volunteers, and even navigating the complex web of local permits and regulations. There were setbacks, of course, times when the funds ran low or the work felt overwhelming. But Enrique was always there to remind her why they were doing this. "You're creating something incredible," he told her one evening as they painted the center's main room. "You're not just changing lives, you're changing the way people see themselves." Maria looked around at the freshly painted walls, the donated furniture waiting to be arranged, and the volunteers bustling in and out. For the first time, she felt the truth of his words. This wasn't just about her or Enrique anymore. It was about every person who would walk through those doors, looking for a second chance. The center officially opened on a crisp autumn morning. Maria stood on the front porch, her heart pounding as a small crowd gathered for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Lucas stood beside her, clutching her hand, his face glowing with excitement. Enrique stepped forward to address the crowd. He spoke of his journey, of the kindness that had saved him, and of the partnership that had made this center possible. When he finished, he handed the scissors to Maria. "This wouldn't exist without you," he said softly. "It's only right that you do the honors." Maria's hands trembled as she cut the ribbon, the crowd erupting into applause. Tears pricked her eyes as she stepped back, letting the first visitors enter the building. She looked at Enrique, her heart full. "We did it," she whispered. Enrique nodded, his eyes shining. "We did." That evening, after the crowds had gone, and the center was quiet, Maria stood in the backyard of the house, gazing at the stars. Lucas was asleep inside, his laughter from the day still echoing in her ears. Enrique joined her, his hands in his pockets. "You okay?" he asked. Maria nodded. "Better than okay. For the first time in a long time, I feel whole." Enrique smiled. "You deserve this, Maria, more than anyone I've ever met." She looked at him, her heart swelling with gratitude and something else she couldn't quite name. "Thank you," she said, "for believing in me, for helping me believe in myself." They stood there in comfortable silence, the night wrapping around them like a warm blanket. The journey that had begun with a simple act of kindness had led them here, to a place where hope wasn't just a possibility. It was a reality. And for Maria, it was only the beginning.